Night settles slowly across the landscape of deep time. The air is quiet. The world is ancient. And somewhere in that quiet, millions of years ago, a small group of primates moves carefully through trees and tall grass. Their lives are simple. They search for food. They watch for danger. They sleep when darkness falls. At first glance, there is nothing unusual about them. They look much like other animals around them. Their brains are not especially large. Their tools are almost non-existent. Their lives follow the same quiet rhythm that has guided creatures on Earth for hundreds of millions of years. And yet, something strange is about to begin. Something small, almost accidental. Something that will slowly change the structure of a brain. And in time, that small change will grow into language, imagination, memory, curiosity, and the strange inner world we call the human mind. Tonight, we gently explore a mystery that scientists still debate, still wonder about, and still piece together from fossils, genes, and ancient clues. The story could be called the evolutionary accident that gave us the human mind. But like many long stories written by nature, it did not begin with intention. It began with tiny changes that no one planned. Changes so small that for thousands of generations, no one would have noticed anything unusual at all. So let us begin far earlier than the first human. Let us begin in a world before thought had the complexity we recognize today. A world where brains existed, but minds, as we know them, did not. If we travel back roughly 500 million years, the Earth looks very different. Life exists mostly in the oceans. Creatures drift, crawl, and swim through shallow seas. Many of them possess nervous systems. Some have simple brains. But these early brains are not places of reflection or imagination. They are tools for survival. A signal travels from eye to muscle. A shadow triggers a quick escape. A smell leads toward food. The brain, in its earliest form, is less like a storyteller and more like a switchboard. It connects senses to actions. Nothing more is required. And for hundreds of millions of years, this basic design works beautifully. Evolution rarely rushes when something already functions well. But here is the interesting part. Even in these early systems, small variations appear. Tiny mutations, slight rearrangements of genes, slight increases in neural connections. Most of these changes disappear. Some remain. And every once in a while, a small change opens a door to something new. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, very slowly. Fast forward now to about 60 million years ago. Dinosaurs are gone. The world has recovered from a massive extinction. Forests stretch across continents. And in those forests, early primates begin to thrive. These creatures live among branches and leaves. Their hands grasp. Their eyes face forward. Their lives depend on navigating a complex, three-dimensional world. Trees require balance. Branches require coordination. Fruit requires memory. Where was that ripe tree yesterday? Which branches are strong enough to hold weight? Where might a predator be hiding? These questions do not require language, but they do require something new. A brain that can remember space. A brain that can plan movements. A brain that can imagine the next branch before the leap begins. And slowly, the primate brain grows slightly larger. Not enormous, just a little more capable. Here's the mystery. For millions of years, primates remain relatively modest in brain size compared to body size. They are clever animals, but not extraordinarily so. Something else must eventually push the brain further. Something unexpected. Now we move closer. about 7 million years ago. In parts of Africa, forests begin to shrink in certain regions. Climate shifts slowly reshape landscapes. Grasslands expand. Some primates remain in the trees, but a few populations begin spending more time on the ground. Standing upright becomes slightly useful. Walking longer distances becomes necessary. Hands become free for carrying objects, food or young. Again, nothing dramatic happens overnight. Evolution almost never works that way. Instead, generation after generation passes with tiny adjustments. Bones shift, muscles reorganize, spines adapt. Brains change just slightly. But notice this quiet detail. Walking upright changes the entire energy system of the body. The hips move differently. The spine curves differently. The head balances differently. And the brain, resting at the top of that structure, slowly begins to receive new patterns of sensory information. Balance signals, movement patterns, visual fields that stretch farther across open land. These signals quietly reshape neural circuits, and the brain begins adapting in ways no one could have predicted. But even now, our ancestors are still not what we would recognize as human thinkers. Their tools are simple. Their communication is limited. Their minds are still closer to those of other intelligent animals. So where does the real shift begin? This is where the story becomes especially intriguing. Roughly 2 million years ago, something begins to accelerate. Fossils from species like Homo habilis and later Homo erectus reveal brains that are noticeably larger than those of earlier hominins. Not just slightly larger, substantially larger. But brain size alone is not the full story. What matters even more is how the brain is organized. The frontal regions begin expanding. These areas are associated with planning, decision-making, and social behavior. But why? Why would evolution suddenly invest so much energy into building such an expensive organ? Brains are costly. They consume enormous amounts of energy. In modern humans, the brain uses about 20% of the body's energy, even though it weighs only about 2% of the body. Nature does not usually spend energy so freely without a powerful reason. So something must have made bigger brains worth the cost. One possibility is social life. Living in groups requires remembering individuals, recognizing alliances, predicting behavior, negotiating cooperation and conflict. Some scientists call this the social brain hypothesis. The idea is simple but powerful. As social groups become more complex, brains must become more capable of managing those relationships. Imagine keeping track of dozens of individuals who trust whom, who shares food, who competes for status. That requires memory. It requires emotional awareness. It requires the ability to imagine another mind. But here's the interesting part. Even social intelligence alone might not fully explain what happens next, because the human mind does something unusual. It does not only understand other individuals, it begins to understand abstract ideas, stories, symbols, future possibilities. And this raises an even deeper question. How did the brain cross that invisible threshold? How did it move from clever animal intelligence to reflective thought? The answer may involve something surprisingly small, a tiny change in genetics. Inside every cell of the body lies DNA, and within DNA lie instructions for building proteins, guiding development, and shaping the growth of organs, including the brain. Occasionally, genes duplicate. A section of DNA accidentally copies itself. At first, this seems unimportant. The body already has the original gene. But now there is an extra copy, and that extra copy is free to change. Sometimes it mutates, sometimes it gains a new function, and sometimes, very rarely, it begins influencing brain development in unexpected ways. In recent years, scientists discovered something remarkable in the human genome. Several genes connected to brain growth appear to have duplicated and evolved in ways not seen in other primates. One of these genes is called ARHGAP11B. It seems to play a role in increasing the number of neurons during brain development. Another group of genes, known as SRGAP2 duplicates, may influence how neurons form connections. When researchers study these genetic changes, they notice something fascinating. These duplications appear to have occurred relatively recently in evolutionary time, perhaps within the last few million years, which raises an intriguing possibility. What if the growth of the human brain was not just a slow, steady trend? What if part of it began with a genetic accident, a duplication, a mutation, a tiny change in the instruction manual of life? At first, this change might have produced only subtle differences, slightly more neurons, slightly longer periods of brain development in children, slightly greater plasticity in neural connections. But those small differences could compound over generations. More neurons allow more connections. More connections allow more complex patterns of thought. And eventually, a brain becomes capable of something extraordinary. It becomes capable of reflecting on itself. But we must move carefully here. Scientists do not believe a single mutation created the human mind overnight. Evolution almost always involves many small changes interacting together. Still, the possibility remains that one or two genetic accidents nudge the brain onto a new path, a path that would eventually lead to art, music, mathematics, and quiet thoughts beneath the night sky. But this transformation did not happen instantly. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors walked the earth with brains larger than earlier hominins, yet still different from ours. Something else still needed to happen, something involving tools, culture, and perhaps even fire, because once the brain begins to grow, it changes the environment, and the environment begins changing the brain in return. This creates a feedback loop. Each generation inherits not only genes, but also behaviors, skills, knowledge, simple traditions. And over time, these traditions grow more complex. Here's the mystery that begins to unfold. When culture begins influencing evolution, evolution can move faster, not in dramatic leaps, but in subtle accelerations. Brains that learn quickly become valuable. Brains that imitate others become valuable. Brains that remember stories become valuable. And slowly, quietly, the architecture of the mind begins expanding. But we are still missing one crucial turning point. A moment when human ancestors crossed from clever tool users into creatures capable of symbolic thought. A moment when ideas themselves became tools. And strangely enough, that turning point may have begun with something as ordinary as cooking food beside a fire. Because fire changes everything. Food becomes softer, energy becomes easier to digest, and the brain, hungry for fuel, receives the resources it needs to grow even further. But that discovery belongs to the next chapter of the story. For now, we leave our ancestors standing beside the first controlled flames, watching sparks drift upward into the dark African sky, unaware that their minds are slowly transforming into something the earth has never seen before. And somewhere within those glowing embers lies the next step in the evolutionary accident that shaped the human mind. The fire crackles softly in the night. A small group, gathers around it. Shadows move across the ground. Sparks drift upward and vanish into darkness. The air smells of smoke, roasted roots, and something else, something new, warmth. For hundreds of millions of years, no animal on Earth had ever controlled fire. Lightning could start it, volcanoes could unleash it, forests could burn with terrifying power. But now, for the first time, a creature sits beside a flame that it helped create, and more importantly, keep alive. The moment seems quiet, but here's the interesting part. Many researchers believe this simple change, learning to control fire, may have altered the course of human evolution in ways no one at the time could possibly understand. Because fire does more than warm the body. It changes food, and food changes the brain. Let's slow down and imagine a world before cooking. Early human ancestors, like most animals, eat their food raw. Raw plants, raw roots, raw meat. But raw food is difficult to digest. It requires strong jaws, powerful chewing muscles, and long hours of grinding tough fibers and tissues. Chimpanzees today, for example, spend as much as 6 hours a day chewing. Their digestive systems work hard. Their teeth and jaws are large and strong. And their brains, while intelligent, remain limited in size. Now something curious begins to appear in the fossil record of early humans. Around 1.8 to 2 million years ago, with species such as Homo erectus, several changes happen at once. Teeth become smaller, jaw muscles shrink, the rib cage becomes narrower, and the brain grows significantly larger. These changes puzzle scientists. Why would jaws shrink while brains grow? At first glance, that seems risky. After all, chewing raw food requires strong jaws. But notice the quiet clue. If food becomes easier to chew and digest, then large jaws are no longer necessary. Cooking softens meat. It breaks down plant fibers. It unlocks calories that would otherwise remain trapped. In simple terms, cooking gives the body more energy from the same food, and the brain, that energy-hungry organ, suddenly has more fuel available. This idea was explored deeply by a primatologist named Richard Wrangham. He proposed what is sometimes called the cooking hypothesis. The theory suggests that once early humans began cooking regularly, their bodies no longer needed such large digestive systems or chewing muscles. That extra energy could be redirected, and evolution may have used it to support the growing brain. But there's another subtle effect of fire that many people overlook. Fire creates light. Before fire, darkness meant sleep. Animals settle down. Activity slows. The night belongs to predators. But fire changes the rhythm of the evening. Now small groups can remain awake after sunset. They can sit together. They can watch the flames. They can communicate. And slowly, something extraordinary begins to develop. Social storytelling. Imagine the quiet circle of early humans gathered around a fire. One individual mimics the movement of an animal they hunted earlier that day. Another gestures toward the horizon, recalling where fruit trees were found. Sounds, gestures, expressions. Small pieces of communication grow more detailed. At first, these are not full languages, but they are more than simple animal calls. They are shared experiences, shared memories, shared knowledge. And here's the fascinating part. Language does not appear suddenly either. It grows slowly, piece by piece, like a bridge being built one stone at a time. Early sounds become signals. Signals become patterns. Patterns become meaning. Over thousands of generations, the brain adapts to process these patterns more efficiently. The regions of the brain that control speech, hearing, and symbolic understanding begin expanding. One famous gene connected to speech development, called FOXP2, appears to have changed slightly in the human lineage. Even small modifications in this gene can influence the ability to control complex vocal movements. Again, we see that same quiet theme in evolution. Small changes, tiny adjustments, but over time, these adjustments combine into something powerful, language, and language transforms the mind. But notice something deeper here. Language does more than communicate information. It allows ideas to exist outside the brain. A thought can now move from one mind into another. A discovery made by one individual can survive after they are gone. Knowledge accumulates, and once knowledge accumulates, culture begins accelerating. Tools improve, hunting strategies evolve, groups become more organized, and each generation starts slightly ahead of the one before. This process is sometimes called cumulative culture. Other animals show hints of it. Some birds learn songs, some primates learn tool use. But humans develop cumulative culture on an entirely different scale. Our ancestors do not just copy behaviors, they refine them. They innovate, they experiment, and every improvement spreads through the group. This process begins slowly, painfully slowly, but it changes everything, because now evolution is no longer working alone. Culture begins shaping the environment that brains must navigate, which means smarter brains become more valuable. Children who learn quickly survive better. Individuals who communicate clearly cooperate better. And over time, natural selection begins favoring minds capable of deeper understanding. But even this explanation still leaves a mystery, because at some point, human minds become capable of things far beyond survival. They imagine spirits, they create art, they bury their dead with care, they paint animals on cave walls. These behaviors appear tens of thousands of years later, but the roots of them may lie in earlier changes already unfolding. And this leads to an intriguing possibility. What if the human mind did not evolve specifically for philosophy, art, or storytelling? What if those abilities were side effects, unexpected consequences of a brain that evolved for social understanding, communication, and problem solving? In other words, perhaps the mind we experience today is not the product of a single purpose. Perhaps it is the result of many evolutionary accidents interacting together. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because another powerful force may have shaped the human brain, and that force is childhood. Human childhood is unusually long, much longer than that of most animals. Chimpanzee infants grow quickly and reach maturity within about 10 years. Human children, by contrast, require nearly 2 decades before full adulthood. At first glance, this seems inefficient. Why would evolution allow such a long period of dependence? But here's the interesting part. During childhood, the brain is incredibly flexible. Neural connections form and reorganize rapidly. Children learn languages effortlessly. They absorb social rules. They experiment, play, and explore. In many ways, childhood is nature's way of training the brain. And the longer childhood becomes, the more learning can occur. Some scientists think that as human culture grew more complex, evolution favored longer developmental periods. Children needed time to learn tools, language, social behavior, and environmental knowledge. So childhood expanded. But expanding childhood requires larger brains capable of prolonged development, which creates a fascinating feedback loop. Larger brains support longer childhood. Longer childhood supports more learning. More learning supports more culture. And more culture favors larger brains. This loop may have slowly pushed human cognition beyond what earlier primates could achieve. Again, not through sudden leaps, but through steady pressure across hundreds of thousands of years. Yet still, the brain remains something of a mystery. Even today, scientists do not fully understand how billions of neurons create consciousness, or how thoughts emerge from electrical signals, or how imagination can build entire worlds inside the mind. But when we look back through evolutionary history, we see clues. Clues hidden in fossils, clues written in DNA, clues carried in the structure of the brain itself. Each clue suggests that the human mind did not arrive through a single event. Instead, it emerged through a long chain of accidents, opportunities, and adaptations. Fire, cooking, social life, language, extended childhood, genetic mutations, each factor nudging the brain in a slightly new direction. And slowly, over millions of years, these forces shape the architecture of thought. But the story still holds deeper layers, because brain size alone cannot explain everything. Neanderthals, for example, had brains as large as, and sometimes larger than, modern humans. Yet their culture remained different. Why? What subtle difference separated their minds from ours? And could the answer lie not in the size of the brain, but in how its networks were connected? Some researchers believe the next key shift in human cognition involved the brain's wiring itself, the networks that allow ideas to combine, travel, and transform. Because when neural networks reach a certain level of complexity, something unexpected may happen. The brain may become capable of recursive thought, thoughts about thoughts, ideas about ideas, the quiet awareness we experience when we reflect on our own mind, self-consciousness. And once that door opens, the human story becomes something entirely new. But the path toward that moment is long and winding. And in the next part of our journey, we will explore the first major turning point, the moment when early human intelligence began transforming from simple survival strategies into something more flexible, more creative, and perhaps even more mysterious. Because somewhere along that path, the brain stopped being just a survival machine and began becoming a storyteller. The night grows deeper. The fire burns low now, glowing more than blazing. A few embers shift softly, and the circle of early humans grows quiet. Some rest, some watch the dark horizon, and somewhere inside those quiet minds, something subtle is unfolding. A new kind of thought is slowly taking shape. Not yet the full human imagination, not yet philosophy or poetry, but a step closer, a small shift in how the brain uses information. And sometimes, in evolution, that kind of shift can change everything. For millions of years, animals solved problems in fairly direct ways. A predator appears, the body reacts, food appears, the animal approaches, rain falls, shelter is found. These actions are guided by instinct, learning, and memory. Many animals today show impressive intelligence. Crows use tools. Dolphins cooperate during hunts. Chimpanzees fashion sticks to collect insects. Yet there is still a difference. Animal intelligence usually remains tied closely to the present moment. Immediate goals, immediate rewards. But somewhere along the human evolutionary path, the brain begins handling information in a slightly different way. Instead of reacting only to what is present, it begins simulating possibilities. What might happen next? What if this plan fails? what if another approach works better? This ability, imagining future outcomes before acting, may seem ordinary to us today. We use it constantly, but in evolutionary terms, it represents a remarkable shift. Because once the brain begins modeling the future, the range of possible behaviors expands dramatically. Suddenly, survival does not depend only on instinct. It depends on planning, and planning requires a brain capable of holding several ideas at once. This is where a crucial region of the brain becomes especially important: the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex sits just behind the forehead. In humans, it is far more developed than in most other animals. This area helps coordinate complex behavior. It allows us to pause before acting, consider alternatives, and imagine consequences. But here's the interesting part. The prefrontal cortex grows slowly. It is one of the last regions of the brain to fully mature, often not finishing development until the mid-20s in modern humans, which suggests something fascinating. Our species evolved a brain designed to remain flexible for a very long time. That flexibility may have allowed early humans to experiment with new strategies, tools, and social structures. But flexibility alone is not enough. The brain also needs ways to combine information from different sources: vision, memory, sound, emotion, movement. All of these signals must come together into a single experience. And sometime during human evolution, the networks connecting different brain regions seem to have expanded. Neurons formed longer pathways. Information could travel farther across the brain. Ideas could interact. This may not sound dramatic at first, but notice the quiet consequence. When information from different domains begins mixing more freely, new patterns can appear. For example, imagine combining memory with imagination. You remember a river that runs through a valley. Now imagine moving that memory slightly. You picture the river flowing somewhere else. You imagine building a trap for animals near its edge. You simulate the outcome in your mind. This ability to recombine mental images, to rearrange experiences into new possibilities, becomes one of the most powerful tools of the human mind, and it likely began very gradually. Archaeologists sometimes look for clues about mental abilities in the tools early humans left behind. Stone tools are especially useful because they survive long after wood and plant materials decay. For a long time, the earliest stone tools remained quite simple. A rock was struck against another rock to create a sharp edge. These early tools, known as Oldowan tools, appeared around 2.6 million years ago. They worked well for cutting meat or breaking bones, but their design remained relatively basic for hundreds of thousands of years. Then something changed. Around 1.7 million years ago, a new style of tool appeared. These tools are called Acheulean hand axes, and they are strikingly different. Instead of rough flakes, these tools are carefully shaped into symmetrical forms, often teardrop-shaped, smooth edges, balanced weight. Creating one requires a sequence of precise strikes. A toolmaker must imagine the final shape before beginning. They must remove flakes in a controlled pattern. Too many strikes in the wrong place can ruin the entire piece. This suggests something important about the mind of the maker. Planning, visualization, patience, and perhaps even a sense of form or beauty. Some researchers have noticed that many Acheulean tools are surprisingly symmetrical, almost elegant, which raises an interesting question. Were these tools shaped purely for function? Or did early humans begin appreciating aesthetic patterns as well? The answer remains uncertain, but either way, the cognitive demands of creating such tools are clear. The brain had to hold an internal image of the finished object, then guide the hands through a series of steps to bring that image into reality. In other words, the brain had begun translating ideas into physical form, but tools were only part of the transformation. Another shift was happening quietly within human social groups. Groups themselves were growing larger, and larger groups create new challenges. More individuals mean more relationships to manage, more alliances, more conflicts, more opportunities for cooperation. To survive within such groups, individuals needed increasingly sophisticated social awareness. Who can be trusted? Who shares food? Who might compete? And perhaps most intriguingly, what are others thinking? This ability, sometimes called theory of mind, allows a person to imagine what another individual knows, believes, or intends. Many animals show limited forms of this skill, but humans appear to possess it at a far deeper level. We constantly infer the thoughts of others. We interpret expressions, tone, and gestures. We predict reactions, and this ability likely evolved because it made cooperation more effective. A group that understands one another can coordinate better. They can hunt together, defend together, share resources. But here's the subtle twist. Once the brain becomes capable of imagining other minds, it may also begin imagining invisible agents, spirits, ancestors, forces of nature. Some researchers believe this ability helped lay the foundation for early belief systems, but those developments will appear much later in the story. For now, the important point is this. The human brain was becoming increasingly specialized for navigating social worlds, and that social complexity may have pushed cognitive abilities further than physical survival alone would require. There's another clue hidden in the rhythms of human life. Sleep. Humans sleep less than many other primates, yet we experience unusually rich dreaming. Dreams combine memories, emotions, and imagination in strange ways. Some scientists think dreaming may help reorganize memories and strengthen neural connections. Others think it may allow the brain to rehearse possible scenarios. A safe place for imagination to experiment. If this idea holds some truth, then dreaming might have quietly supported the expansion of human creativity. Night after night, the brain practices weaving fragments of experience into new patterns, and over thousands of generations, this ability becomes stronger. The mind grows comfortable exploring possibilities beyond the present moment, but perhaps the most profound shift of all begins with something very simple. Teaching. In many animal species, young individuals learn mostly through observation. They watch adults and imitate behavior. But human learning gradually becomes more intentional. Adults demonstrate techniques. They guide younger individuals. They correct mistakes. And when teaching becomes part of culture, knowledge spreads faster. A discovery made by one individual can influence the entire group. And once that happens, cultural evolution begins moving more quickly than biological evolution. Ideas travel faster than genes. Tools improve from generation to generation. Techniques accumulate. And the brain adapts to this increasingly complex environment. Some scientists describe this process as a kind of evolutionary partnership between biology and culture. The brain supports culture. Culture reshapes the brain, and the cycle continues. But even with all these changes, tools, planning, teaching, social awareness, the human mind still has not reached its most dramatic transformation. That moment lies further ahead, because somewhere in the last few 100,000 years, a threshold appears, a threshold where the brain becomes capable of symbolic thought. Symbols allow one thing to represent another. A mark on a cave wall can represent an animal. A sound can represent an idea. A gesture can represent an agreement. And once symbols emerge, the mind gains access to an entirely new dimension of thought. Stories, art, myth, mathematics, all of them depend on symbols. But the appearance of symbolic thinking is one of the greatest mysteries in human evolution. Did it appear suddenly? Or did it grow slowly over thousands of years? Some archaeologists believe the shift happened gradually, scattered across different human populations. Others suspect there may have been a tipping point, a moment when brain networks reached enough complexity to support a new level of abstraction. Whatever the cause, the evidence begins appearing around 100,000 to 70,000 years ago. Beads made from shells, engraved patterns on stones, carefully arranged burials. These clues suggest that the human mind was beginning to think in ways no other species ever had. But before that transformation fully unfolded, another group of humans walked the earth. Close relatives, powerful hunters, with large brains and complex lives, the Neanderthals. And their story may hold one of the most intriguing clues about the evolutionary accident that gave rise to our own minds. Because despite their intelligence, something about the human mind eventually followed a slightly different path. A path that would lead to art, language, and culture spreading across the entire planet. But what exactly made the difference? That mystery waits just ahead. The wind moves softly across an ancient landscape. Cold air drifts over valleys and forests that stretch across Ice Age Europe and Western Asia. Herds of large animals move slowly across open plains. Woolly rhinoceroses graze. Mammoths wander through snow-dusted grasslands. And among them live another kind of human, strong, adaptable, intelligent. The Neanderthals. For a long time, people imagined Neanderthals as primitive creatures. Rough, simple, almost animal-like. But modern research has quietly changed that picture. The more scientists study Neanderthal fossils and artifacts, the more they discover that these humans were far more capable than once believed. Their brains were large, sometimes even slightly larger than those of modern humans. They made tools, they hunted in groups, they cared for injured individuals, and in some cases, they may have buried their dead. So here is the mystery. If Neanderthals possessed large brains and complex lives, why did the particular form of symbolic culture we associate with modern humans spread so dramatically with Homo sapiens instead? Why did our lineage develop such explosive creativity? Why cave paintings? Why musical instruments? Why myths and stories that travel across generations? The difference, it seems, may lie not in how big the brain was, but in how it was organized. When scientists compare the skulls of Neanderthals and modern humans, they notice subtle differences. Neanderthal skulls are longer and more elongated. Modern human skulls are more rounded. This shape difference reflects underlying changes in the brain itself, particularly in the parietal regions, areas involved in integrating information from multiple senses and supporting complex visual imagination. The rounding of the human skull may indicate expanded neural networks connecting different brain systems, and those connections may have made a surprising difference, because when different regions of the brain communicate more fluidly, ideas can mix in unexpected ways. Memories combine with images. Sounds connect with emotions. Concepts blend into metaphors. And gradually, the mind becomes capable of symbolic thought. But notice something important. Symbolic thinking does not require a single special brain structure. It emerges from networks, large webs of neurons passing signals back and forth, which means that once a certain level of connectivity is reached, the brain may begin doing things it was never specifically designed to do. Much like how a city becomes more vibrant once enough roads connect different neighborhoods. Ideas begin traveling, interacting, transforming, and suddenly the mind becomes a landscape of possibilities. One of the earliest clues of symbolic thinking appears in something very small: shell beads. Around 100,000 years ago, in parts of Africa, humans began drilling holes in shells and wearing them as ornaments. At first glance, this might seem like a minor behavior, but it carries deep significance, because a bead does not help you hunt. It does not cut meat. It does not keep you warm. Instead, it represents something: identity, group membership, status, perhaps even beauty. And once objects begin representing ideas, the door to symbolic culture opens. Another clue appears in engraved patterns: simple cross-hatched lines carved into pieces of ochre or stone. Some of these markings date back at least 75,000 years. Again, they are not tools. They are marks with meaning, perhaps personal, perhaps cultural. We may never know exactly what those patterns meant, but their existence tells us something profound. The human mind had begun creating symbols, and symbols allow thoughts to travel beyond the present moment. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. Once symbolic thinking appears, culture begins accelerating dramatically, because symbols allow ideas to be stored outside the brain. A drawing can preserve knowledge. A story can transmit history. A song can encode memory. And with each generation, these symbols accumulate. Children inherit not only genes, but also an expanding library of shared knowledge, which means each new generation begins slightly further along than the last. Over time, this creates a kind of cultural snowball effect. Small innovations build upon earlier ones. Stone tools improve. Clothing becomes more sophisticated. Shelters grow more complex. And the brain adapts to this increasingly rich environment of ideas. But this raises another question. Why did symbolic culture appear when it did? Human ancestors had large brains for hundreds of thousands of years before symbolic artifacts appear widely. So what changed? Some scientists suspect the answer may involve population size. For most of human history, populations were extremely small. Scattered bands of perhaps a few dozen individuals lived across large landscapes. In such small groups, cultural innovations could easily disappear if the individuals carrying them died. But as populations slowly grew and groups interacted more frequently, ideas had more chances to spread. Imagine a new technique for shaping tools. In a small, isolated group, that knowledge might vanish after one generation. But in a network of connected groups, the idea can travel. It can be refined, improved, shared. Over time, the entire cultural system becomes more resilient. And as culture grows more complex, it begins placing new demands on the brain. Memory expands. Language becomes richer. Social coordination becomes more intricate. The mind evolves within this expanding web of culture. And perhaps most importantly, imagination begins exploring entirely new territories. Some of the most breathtaking evidence of this appears in cave art. Deep inside caves in France and Spain, ancient humans painted animals on stone walls. Bison, horses, lions, mammoths. These paintings date back more than 30,000 years. Some are remarkably detailed. Graceful lines capture the movement of animals. Shadows and curves give the images life. Standing inside those caves today, one feels a quiet sense of connection. Because the individuals who painted those animals were not so different from us. They imagined, they created, they expressed something internal. And this is where the human mind becomes truly unique. It no longer serves only survival. It begins expressing meaning. Meaning about the world, meaning about existence, meaning about life and death. But remember something important. This transformation did not happen because evolution decided to produce artists. Instead, it likely happened because the brain had become flexible enough to support many different forms of thought. Once neural networks reached a certain complexity, creativity emerged as a natural side effect, an evolutionary accident in a sense. The brain built for survival suddenly found itself capable of poetry. And yet, while these changes unfolded, another question remained. What happened to the Neanderthals? They lived alongside modern humans for thousands of years. They hunted similar animals. They survived harsh climates. They even interbred with early modern humans. In fact, many people today still carry small amounts of Neanderthal DNA. But eventually, around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals disappeared. Why? The answer remains uncertain. Some researchers believe climate changes may have reduced their populations. Others think competition with modern humans played a role. Still others suspect that differences in social networks or cultural flexibility may have given Homo sapiens a subtle advantage. Perhaps modern human groups exchanged ideas more rapidly. Perhaps their symbolic communication allowed larger alliances. Or perhaps the difference was simply chance. History often turns on fragile circumstances, a few harsh winters, a few lost hunting seasons. Small populations can vanish quietly, and with them, entire branches of human history. But even as Neanderthals faded, the human mind continued expanding. Language grew richer, myths began forming, music appeared. Flutes carved from bird bones have been found in European caves, some dating back over 40,000 years. Imagine that moment. A human lifts a carved bone to their lips. Air passes through carefully placed holes, and suddenly, sound becomes music. For the first time in Earth's history, a species transforms breath into melody. It is a small act, yet also a profound one. Because music is not required for survival. It exists in the realm of emotion, connection, and meaning. And this is perhaps the most mysterious outcome of the evolutionary accident that shaped the human mind. A brain that evolved for hunting and gathering now composes songs. A brain that evolved for social cooperation now wonders about the stars. But even as symbolic culture spreads across continents, the mind itself continues evolving. Because once language becomes sophisticated enough, it unlocks an entirely new power. The power to think about thinking. And that ability, reflective awareness, may represent the next great shift in the story of the human mind. A shift that will quietly reshape everything. The night sky above the Ice Age world is brilliant. Without cities, without electric light, the stars shine with quiet intensity. Thousands of them scatter across the darkness like pale dust. For tens of thousands of years, humans have looked upward at those lights. At first, perhaps only with curiosity, but eventually with questions. And that moment, when a creature begins asking questions about the universe, may represent one of the most extraordinary shifts in evolutionary history, because somewhere along the long path of human development, the brain gained the ability to examine itself, to notice its own thoughts, to reflect, to wonder. This quiet ability is called the metacognition, thinking about thinking, and it may be one of the most defining features of the human mind. To understand why this matters, we can return to something we touched on earlier. For most animals, intelligence operates within the present moment. An animal remembers past experiences and uses them to guide behavior, but it doesn't usually sit still and examine its own thoughts. It does not ask, "Why did I think that?" or "What might someone else believe about this situation?" Human minds, however, do this constantly. You notice your emotions. You analyze your decisions. You imagine how others see you. And sometimes, late at night, you even reflect on the nature of your own consciousness. But here's the interesting part. Metacognition likely did not evolve for philosophical reflection. Instead, it may have emerged as a tool for navigating complex social life. In early human groups, social relationships were everything. A hunter might rely on others for protection. Food might be shared among families. Conflicts might need careful negotiation. If someone broke trust, the consequences could ripple through the group. To survive in such environments, it became increasingly valuable to understand not only what others were doing, but what they were thinking. Did that person mean to insult you? Are they planning to cooperate tomorrow? Do they believe your explanation? These questions require imagining another person's mind. And once the brain develops the ability to simulate another mind, it becomes surprisingly easy to turn that ability inward, to observe one's own thoughts, to evaluate one's own decisions. In other words, the machinery used for social intelligence may have accidentally produced self-awareness. An evolutionary side effect, but a powerful one, because once self-awareness appears, the mind enters a completely new landscape. Now the brain can examine ideas the way hands examine objects. You can turn a thought around, look at it from different angles, compare it to other ideas, and even question whether it is true. This ability allows humans to build complex systems of knowledge. Science, philosophy, law, mathematics. All of these depend on reflective thinking, but the earliest expressions of metacognition likely appeared in far simpler forms. Consider storytelling. Long before written language existed, humans shared stories around fires, stories about hunts, stories about ancestors, stories about mysterious forces in the natural world. These stories helped groups preserve knowledge, but they also did something deeper. They allowed people to imagine experiences beyond their own. Through story, one mind could enter another. Through story, lessons could travel across generations. And over time, storytelling became one of the most powerful tools for shaping human thought. Because stories organize information in ways that the brain finds easy to remember. Characters, conflicts, resolutions. These patterns help knowledge survive in memory. But they also create meaning. Meaning about who we are. Meaning about where we came from. Meaning about how the world works. And once humans began telling stories about their origins, the human mind stepped into an entirely new dimension. Some of the earliest known myths likely emerged long before written history. These myths may have tried to explain natural events, thunder, storms, the movement of the sun and moon. To early humans, the world was full of mystery. And when the brain tries to understand mystery, it often reaches for familiar patterns. One of those patterns is agency. If something moves, perhaps something caused it. If lightning strikes, perhaps someone sent it. In this way, the same mental systems used to understand other human minds may have helped early humans imagine invisible agents in nature, spirits, gods, forces beyond the visible world. Some scientists call this tendency the hyperactive agency detection system. The brain prefers to assume that events have intentional causes. From an evolutionary perspective, this bias may have been useful. If a rustling sound in the grass might be a predator, it is safer to assume danger than to ignore it. But this same bias may also have shaped early spiritual beliefs. The mind searches for patterns, and sometimes it finds meaning even where none was intended. Yet these beliefs also served social purposes. Shared myths strengthened group identity. They created common rules and values. They helped communities cooperate on larger scales. And as societies grew more complex, these shared belief systems became powerful cultural forces. But once again, notice the theme quietly running through this story. None of these developments required evolution to aim specifically for religion or philosophy. They emerged naturally from cognitive systems designed for other purposes: social intelligence, pattern recognition, language. Together, these abilities created a mind capable of constructing entire worlds of meaning, and those worlds would eventually shape human civilization. Another fascinating development begins appearing in archaeological evidence during the later stages of human prehistory. Long-distance trade, certain materials, such as rare stones or shells, have been found far from their natural sources. This suggests that human groups were exchanging goods across large distances. Trade requires trust, communication, shared expectations, but it also requires symbolic value. A shell necklace may not provide practical survival benefits, yet it can carry meaning, status, connection, belonging. These symbolic systems allowed human societies to organize themselves in increasingly complex ways. And as social systems grew larger, language became even more important, because language allows ideas to scale. A spoken rule can guide the behavior of an entire community. A shared story can unite hundreds of individuals who may never meet face to face. And eventually, language would lead to something even more transformative: writing. But the moment lies thousands of years ahead in our story. For now, we remain in a world where knowledge travels through voices, memory, and symbols. And the human mind continues evolving within this expanding cultural network. But there is another dimension of the mind that quietly grows during this period: creativity. Creativity is difficult to define. It involves combining ideas in ways that have never existed before. A new tool design, a new story, a new piece of art. At first glance, creativity might seem like a luxury, something extra. But in uncertain environments, creative thinking can provide powerful advantages. A creative hunter might invent a new trap. A creative toolmaker might shape a sharper blade. A creative communicator might unite people more effectively. Over time, individuals capable of flexible thinking may have helped their group survive in changing conditions, which means natural selection could gradually favor minds capable of generating new ideas. But again, creativity may not have evolved as a separate ability. Instead, it likely emerged from the increasing connectivity of brain networks. When ideas from different domains interact freely, new combinations appear, and sometimes those combinations lead to innovation. This same cognitive flexibility that once helped humans survive harsh climates would later produce art, science, and technology. Yet its origins lie deep in our evolutionary past. There is one more quiet shift taking place during this long journey. Time itself becomes something humans begin to think about differently. Animals remember past events and anticipate near-future outcomes. But humans develop the ability to construct extended narratives across time. We imagine distant futures. We recall ancient pasts. We place ourselves within a timeline that stretches beyond our own lives. This sense of time allows planning on entirely new scales. Communities prepare for seasonal migrations. Generations pass down knowledge about landscapes. Stories preserve memories of events long after they occur. And slowly, humans begin seeing themselves as part of something larger than the present moment. A lineage, a history, a story that continues beyond the individual. But with this awareness comes something else. The realization of mortality, the awareness that life ends. And when a mind capable of reflection encounters that realization, new questions arise. What happens after death? What is the purpose of life? Why does the universe exist at all? These questions may have first appeared quietly around ancient fires, but they would echo through every civilization that followed. Yet even with all these developments, language, art, myth, reflection, the human mind still contains mysteries that science continues to explore today. Because beneath our thoughts lies a complex network of neurons, chemistry, and electrical signals. And understanding how those signals produce conscious experience remains one of the greatest puzzles in modern science. In the next part of our journey, we will gently explore the theories scientists have proposed to explain how the human mind emerged from the brain. Some of these ideas are elegant, some are controversial, and some suggest that the human mind may have arisen from a series of fortunate accidents, tiny shifts that transformed a survival machine into something capable of curiosity and wonder. And perhaps in that process, the universe gained a way to observe itself. Type continue. For section 6, the fire has burned down to glowing coals. The night is still. Somewhere in the distance, a quiet wind moves through tall grass. Above, the stars continue their silent journey across the sky. And beneath that sky sits the most intricate object evolution has ever produced. The human brain. It weighs only about 1.5 kilograms. Soft, fragile, easily damaged. Yet inside it are roughly 86 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others. Trillions of signals travel through these networks every second. Electric pulses, chemical messengers, patterns of activity that form perceptions, memories, and thoughts. But here is the mystery that continues to puzzle scientists. How did such a system arise through evolution? How did a biological organ slowly transform into something capable of mathematics, art, and self-awareness? Researchers have proposed many theories. Some focus on social life, others on language, others on environmental challenges. And many believe the answer is not one single cause, but a quiet convergence of several forces. So in this part of the story, we move gently through some of the ideas scientists have explored, not as final answers, but as possibilities. clues in the long puzzle of the human mind. One of the most widely discussed explanations is called the social brain hypothesis. This idea suggests that the complexity of human intelligence evolved primarily because of social relationships. Living in groups is demanding. Even a small group of 20 individuals creates a web of relationships. Who trusts whom? Who shares resources? Who competes for status? Who forms alliances? Managing this network requires memory, empathy, and strategic thinking. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar studied the relationship between brain size and group size across primate species. He noticed a pattern. Species with larger brains tended to live in larger, more complex social groups. From this pattern, he proposed what is now known as Dunbar's number. The idea that humans can maintain stable social relationships with roughly 150 individuals. Whether the number is exact or not, the underlying concept is compelling. Our brains may have expanded partly because social life demanded it, but this explanation alone may not fully capture the story. Because other animals also live in groups, yet their minds did not develop symbolic language or complex culture. So scientists began exploring other possibilities. Another idea is known as the ecological intelligence hypothesis. This theory suggests that environmental challenges pushed early humans toward more flexible thinking. Imagine surviving in a landscape that constantly changes. Seasons shift. Animals migrate. Plants ripen at different times. Water sources appear and disappear. To survive in such environments, a creature must remember locations, anticipate patterns, and adapt strategies. Over time, individuals capable of flexible problem-solving may have gained an advantage. Their brains allowed them to track resources across large territories. They could invent tools or techniques when conditions changed, and this adaptability would gradually favor larger and more complex brains. Yet again, this explanation may be only part of the picture, because other animals also face challenging environments without developing language or symbolic culture. So researchers continued searching for additional pieces of the puzzle. One especially intriguing idea involves sexual selection. This concept suggests that certain mental abilities evolved, partly because they made individuals more attractive to potential mates. Just as peacocks display elaborate feathers, humans may display intelligence through creativity, humor, storytelling, and music. A clever individual who can entertain others or invent new ideas might gain social admiration. That admiration could translate into reproductive success. Over many generations, traits associated with creative thinking could become more common. Some scientists have even compared human creativity to a kind of intellectual display, a way of signaling cognitive fitness. This theory remains debated, but it highlights an important point. Evolution does not always favor traits solely because they help individuals survive. Sometimes traits spread because they help individuals reproduce. And human social life, with its rich emotional and cultural dimensions, may have amplified this process. Another fascinating proposal centers on cultural evolution itself. Once culture began accumulating knowledge, it created a new environment, a mental environment. Children growing up in human communities faced an increasingly complex world of tools, rules, and language. Brains that could learn quickly and adapt to cultural systems had an advantage. Over time, this may have created a feedback loop. Culture became more complex. Brains adapted to handle that complexity, which allowed culture to grow even further. This process is sometimes called gene culture coevolution. Genes shape brains. Brains produce culture. Culture reshapes the conditions under which genes evolve. And the cycle continues. This partnership between biology and culture may be one of the most powerful forces in human evolution. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of the human mind is consciousness itself. What is it exactly? Why does the brain produce subjective experience? Why do electrical signals in neurons create sensations, thoughts, and awareness? Scientists still do not fully understand. Some theories suggest consciousness arises when information becomes widely shared across different brain systems. This idea is sometimes called the global workspace theory. According to this view, many processes in the brain occur unconsciously, but when information enters a global network that connects multiple regions, it becomes part of conscious awareness. Other researchers propose that consciousness may arise from patterns of integrated information within neural networks. This idea suggests that when systems become complex enough to integrate information across many connections, subjective experience emerges. Yet even these theories remain incomplete, because consciousness is not something we can observe directly. Each person experiences it privately. We can measure brain activity, but the feeling of being aware, the inner experience of existence, remains deeply mysterious. And perhaps that mystery is part of what makes the human mind so fascinating. There is another theory that carries a particularly intriguing idea. It suggests that the human mind may not be a single unified system. Instead, it may be composed of many specialized modules that evolved for different purposes. One module for language, one for social reasoning, one for spatial navigation, one for recognizing faces. Over time, these modules may have become more interconnected, and when they began communicating freely with one another, new forms of thought became possible. For example, combining spatial imagination with storytelling could produce visual narratives. Combining emotional systems with symbolic language could create poetry. Combining mathematical reasoning with pattern recognition could lead to science. In this view, creativity emerges when different mental systems interact in novel ways, and that interaction may have become more powerful as neural connections increased. Once again, we see the same theme: complexity, connectivity, small changes accumulating until entirely new capabilities appear. Some scientists even wonder whether the human brain reached a point where emergent properties appeared. An emergent property is something that arises from complexity, but cannot be predicted simply by examining individual parts. For example, a single neuron cannot think, but billions of neurons interacting together produce thought. Water molecules alone are not wet, yet when many molecules interact, wetness emerges. Similarly, consciousness and imagination may be emergent properties of neural complexity. Once the brain reached a certain level of organization, these abilities simply appeared, not because evolution specifically aimed for them, but because complex systems often produce surprising behaviors. If this is true, then the human mind may truly be the result of an evolutionary accident, not an accident in the sense of randomness without cause, but an unintended consequence of biological systems becoming increasingly complex. Evolution built a survival machine, and that machine unexpectedly gained the ability to wonder about itself. And yet, even with all these theories, the human mind remains partly mysterious, because the story is still unfolding. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years, But civilization, cities, writing, science, has existed for only a tiny fraction of that time. Most of the human journey took place long before recorded history, long before books, long before telescopes and microscopes. Yet the seeds of curiosity were already present. Curiosity about animals, about seasons, about the stars. And perhaps that curiosity itself is one of the most important evolutionary developments, because curiosity drives learning. It pushes the mind to explore, to ask questions, to seek patterns. And when curiosity combines with language and culture, knowledge can expand faster than ever before. But the human mind does not exist in isolation. It is part of a much larger web of life. And in the next part of our journey, we will widen the lens. We will explore how the evolution of the human mind fits within the broader story of intelligence on Earth. Because humans are not the only creatures capable of thought. Other minds exist in different forms, different shapes, different environments. And by understanding those minds, we may gain deeper insight into our own. The embers fade slowly. The night is quiet again. And for a moment we step back from the long human story and look at the wider world. Because the human mind did not evolve in isolation. It emerged within a planet already full of intelligence. Different kinds of minds had been evolving for hundreds of millions of years before humans appeared. Each mind shaped by its own environment. Each brain solving its own problems. And when we widen our view, something remarkable becomes clear. The human mind is not the only path evolution discovered. It is just one branch in a much larger forest of thinking creatures. Consider the octopus, an animal that lives in the ocean, far removed from the primate lineage. Its ancestors diverged from ours more than 500 million years ago. Yet the octopus possesses a surprisingly sophisticated nervous system. It can solve puzzles, open jars, navigate mazes, and even recognize individual humans in laboratory settings. But the octopus brain is organized very differently from ours. Instead of a single centralized brain controlling everything, much of its nervous system is distributed throughout its arms. Each arm contains thousands of neurons capable of local decision-making. In a sense, the octopus is a creature with many semi-independent minds cooperating together. This reminds us that intelligence can evolve in very different forms. Evolution does not follow a single blueprint. It experiments, sometimes producing minds that look nothing like our own. Birds offer another fascinating example. For a long time, scientists believed that birds were not especially intelligent. Their brains appeared small and smooth compared to mammalian brains. But research in recent decades has quietly overturned that assumption. Certain birds, especially corvids, crows, ravens, and jays, display remarkable cognitive abilities. They use tools, they plan for future needs, they remember hundreds of hidden food locations. Some experiments even suggest that crows can understand simple cause and effect relationships. Yet bird brains are organized differently from mammalian brains. They lack the layered neocortex that humans and other primates possess. Instead, they evolved alternative neural structures that perform similar functions. In other words, intelligence evolved independently in birds, a separate experiment conducted by nature, and it reached surprisingly similar outcomes. This phenomenon is known as convergent evolution. Different evolutionary paths leading to similar solutions. Dolphins and whales also present intriguing forms of intelligence. Their brains are large, their social structures complex. They communicate through a rich variety of sounds and signals. Some dolphin populations even display cultural behaviors passed from one generation to another. For example, certain groups teach their young to use marine sponges as tools while searching for food along the seafloor. This behavior spreads through social learning, very much like early human cultural traditions. And yet dolphins live in an environment entirely different from ours. The ocean shapes their senses, their movement, and their ways of interacting with the world. Still, their intelligence reminds us of something important. The capacity for complex thought is not unique to humans alone. Evolution seems to rediscover it again and again under the right conditions. But here is the subtle difference. While many animals display intelligence, the human mind appears uniquely suited for cumulative culture. Ideas that grow layer upon layer across generations. Crows may invent tools, but their descendants do not gradually develop advanced engineering. Dolphins may communicate, but they have not developed symbolic writing systems. Human culture, by contrast, builds continuously. Knowledge accumulates. New discoveries expand upon older ones. And once writing appears, knowledge can travel across centuries. This difference may not lie in intelligence alone. It may lie in a combination of abilities working together. Language, imitation, teaching, shared attention. The ability to imagine what another mind understands. Together, these abilities create a powerful cultural engine, one that allows information to grow faster than biology itself can evolve. Another intriguing comparison comes from our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos. Genetically, humans share about 98 to 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees. That difference, only 1 or 2%, may seem small, yet it leads to profound differences in cognition. Chimpanzees are clever tool users. They hunt cooperatively. They display complex social behaviors, but their cultural traditions remain limited compared to those of humans. Why? Some scientists believe the difference may involve the development of shared intentionality. Shared intentionality is the ability for two or more individuals to focus on the same goal, while understanding that they are cooperating together. Human children develop this ability very early. They point to objects to share attention. They look to others for confirmation. They engage in collaborative play. Chimpanzees, by contrast, tend to focus more on individual goals. They cooperate in certain situations, but do not appear to share intentions in the same way humans do. This small difference may have enormous consequences, because once groups share intentions, they can coordinate complex activities, build structures, develop systems of rules, create institutions, and gradually form societies far larger than any other primate group. There is another factor that may have played a quiet role in the rise of the human mind. Diet. Early humans began eating more calorie-rich foods, including cooked meat and roots. These foods provided the energy necessary to support growing brains. But diet may also have influenced brain chemistry. Certain nutrients, such as omega-3 fatty acids found in fish and other foods, are important for neural development. Access to such nutrients may have supported brain growth during critical stages of evolution. Again, we see that the development of the human mind may have depended on a complex web of interacting factors: genetics, diet, social life, culture, environment. None alone explains the entire transformation, but together they slowly shape the mind we experience today. Another branch of the story leads us to migration. At some point, around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, modern humans began spreading out of Africa in larger numbers. Small groups moved into new landscapes, across deserts, through forests, along coastlines, eventually reaching Europe, Asia, Australia, and later the Americas. Each environment presented new challenges. Cold climates required new clothing. Coastal regions encouraged fishing. Mountain regions demanded adaptation to thin air. And with each new environment, human ingenuity expanded, tools diversified, shelters improved, social systems evolved. But migration also carried ideas across great distances. Different groups met. They exchanged technologies and stories. Culture flowed between populations. And the human mind continued adapting to this ever-changing network of knowledge. When we step back and view the entire picture, the evolution of the human mind begins to resemble a long, branching river, many streams feeding into one larger flow, environmental pressures shaping bodies and brains, social interactions demanding greater understanding, cultural innovations creating new learning environments, and beneath it all, tiny genetic mutations quietly altering neural development. No single moment created the human mind. Instead, countless small changes accumulated across millions of years, but every once in a while, the system may have crossed a threshold, a point where complexity produced something entirely new. Language, symbolic thinking, self-awareness, and eventually, the ability to reflect on our own origins. It is a strange thought, if you pause and consider it. The universe produced stars. Stars created heavier elements. Those elements formed planets. Life emerged from chemistry. And after billions of years of evolution, one species developed a brain capable of asking how it all began. The universe, in a sense, became aware of itself through the minds of living creatures. Not because evolution planned it, but because complex systems sometimes give rise to unexpected possibilities, and the human mind may be one of those possibilities, an accident of complexity, a quiet byproduct of survival strategies and social cooperation, yet one with extraordinary consequences. Because once a species becomes capable of reflection and curiosity, its future may unfold in ways no evolutionary process could fully predict. And that leads us gently into the next chapter of our story. A chapter about what the human mind has done with the abilities it evolved. How those abilities transformed landscapes, societies, and eventually the entire planet. But also how the ancient echoes of our evolutionary past still shape the way we think, feel, and understand the world. Dawn begins slowly over the ancient world. A faint line of pale light appears on the horizon. The stars fade one by one. The air grows cooler for a moment before the sun rises again. And across the earth, small groups of humans wake beside dying embers of last night's fires. They stretch. They prepare for the day. They gather tools, check the sky, listen for movement in the grass. Their lives are simple in many ways, yet inside their minds lives something entirely new in the history of life. A mind capable of imagining the future, and that quiet ability, imagining what does not yet exist, will slowly transform the entire planet. For most of human history, survival depended on adapting to nature. Humans followed migrating animals. They moved with the seasons. They gathered plants where they grew. But as human minds grew more capable of planning and cooperation, something subtle began to change. Humans no longer only adapted to environments, they began reshaping them. At first, the changes were small. Controlled fire cleared patches of land. Simple shelters appeared near water sources. Groups returned to familiar places year after year. Over time, people began recognizing patterns in plants and animals. Seeds dropped near camps sometimes sprouted the following season. Certain plants grew better when soil was disturbed. Animals returned to predictable grazing grounds. And slowly, very slowly, the idea of cultivation began forming in human minds. Not everywhere at once, not quickly, but in scattered regions across the world, humans began experimenting with a new relationship to the land. Planting, tending, harvesting. This quiet shift would later become known as agriculture. But its roots lie deep in the cognitive abilities that had been evolving for hundreds of thousands of years. Planning, memory, cooperation, symbolic communication. Without those mental abilities, agriculture would not have been possible. Agriculture required patience. Seeds planted in spring might not produce food for months. Communities had to imagine the future and act for it. They had to store food, protect crops, coordinate labor, and these demands encouraged new forms of social organization. Villages formed, families settled in one place. Over generations, settlements grew larger. And with larger communities came new challenges. Disputes needed resolution. Resources needed management. Knowledge needed preservation. The human mind, already shaped by social complexity, now began organizing entire societies. Rules emerged. Traditions formed. Shared stories helped unify groups. And gradually, the foundations of civilization began appearing. But remember something important. None of this happened because evolution intended humans to build cities. Instead, the abilities that made civilization possible were originally shaped for much simpler purposes. Tracking animals, remembering landscapes, understanding social relationships. The evolutionary accident that gave us the human mind had unintended consequences. Once imagination and cooperation reached a certain level, entirely new possibilities emerged, and humans began building worlds within the world. One of the most powerful tools that accelerated this transformation was writing. For most of human history, knowledge traveled only through memory and speech. Stories carried history. Songs preserved traditions. But memory has limits. Information can fade or change. Writing changed that. When humans began marking symbols onto clay tablets, stone, or papyrus, knowledge gained a new form of permanence. Ideas could survive the death of the person who discovered them. Instructions could travel across generations. Laws could guide entire societies. And once writing spread, cultural knowledge began accumulating faster than ever before. Agricultural techniques improved. Trade networks expanded. Mathematics and astronomy developed. And the human mind found itself navigating increasingly complex systems of knowledge. But this new environment also changed the brain in subtle ways, because the human brain is remarkably adaptable. It reshapes itself based on experience. When children learn language, specific neural networks strengthen. When people learn to read, visual regions of the brain begin cooperating with language areas. In this sense, culture does not only shape societies, it shapes brains. Each generation grows within a slightly different cognitive environment, and the human mind continues evolving, not only through genes, but through learning. But the same cognitive abilities that allowed humans to build civilizations also created new challenges. Large societies require trust between strangers. They require systems of law and governance. They require shared beliefs that unite individuals who may never meet. And once populations grew into thousands, then millions, then billions, the complexity of human social life expanded beyond anything our ancestors had experienced. Yet our brains still carry the ancient wiring of small tribal groups. We evolved to understand perhaps dozens or hundreds of individuals, not entire nations, not digital networks connecting billions of people. This mismatch between ancient brains and modern environments sometimes creates tension. Our emotional systems react strongly to small social signals. Our pattern-seeking minds sometimes see threats where none exist. Our storytelling instincts can turn complex realities into simple narratives. In many ways, the human mind still carries echoes of the ancient world, where it evolved. And understanding those echoes helps explain many aspects of modern human behavior. Yet alongside these challenges, the human mind has also produced extraordinary achievements: science, medicine, technology, art, music. All of these arise from the same cognitive abilities that once helped early humans survive harsh landscapes: curiosity, creativity, cooperation. And perhaps most importantly, the desire to understand. Over centuries, humans have gradually uncovered many secrets of the universe: the movement of planets, the structure of atoms, the age of the earth, the origins of life. Each discovery adds another piece to the great puzzle. And in a quiet way, this process continues the same curiosity that ancient humans felt when looking up at the stars, the same curiosity that first asked questions about fire, animals, and seasons, the same curiosity that now studies the brain itself. Today, neuroscience continues exploring the mechanisms behind thought and consciousness. Scientists map neural circuits, study electrical signals, investigate how memories form and fade. And yet, even with advanced technology, the mind remains partly mysterious. We understand many processes within the brain, but the inner experience of awareness, the feeling of being a conscious self, still resists complete explanation. Some researchers believe future discoveries will eventually solve this puzzle. Others suspect that consciousness may always contain elements that science can describe but never fully capture. Either way, the investigation itself is part of the remarkable story of the human mind, because evolution produced a brain capable not only of thinking, but of studying its own thinking, a loop of awareness examining itself. And when we step back again and look at the entire arc of this story, something quietly astonishing appears. The human mind did not arise from a single moment. It was not designed in advance. Instead, it emerged from countless small changes across millions of years. Genetic mutations, environmental pressures, social cooperation, cultural learning, each factor shaping the brain in subtle ways. And at some point along that path, a threshold was crossed. A mind capable of imagination appeared. A mind capable of reflection, a mind capable of asking questions about its own origins. From that moment onward, the story of life gained a new chapter, because once a species can reflect on itself, evolution enters a new phase, one guided not only by natural selection, but by conscious choice. Humans now shape ecosystems, develop technologies, explore space, and even attempt to understand the processes that created them. But beneath all these achievements lies the same ancient brain, a brain shaped by forests, savannas, firelight, and long nights beneath open skies. And in the next and final part of our journey, we will slow down and reflect on what this long evolutionary story means, not only for understanding the past, but for understanding ourselves, because the human mind is both ancient and new, both biological and cultural, both accidental and extraordinary, and its story may still be only beginning. The sun has now risen fully over the landscape. Soft light stretches across valleys and rivers, across forests and distant mountains. The world is awake again. Birds move through the morning air. Wind brushes quietly through tall grass. And somewhere, in every corner of the planet, human minds begin another day of thinking. Some will plan their work. Some will read or write. Some will ask questions. Some will simply sit for a moment and watch the sky. All of these moments are small, ordinary, yet each one is made possible by a story that began millions of years ago, a story written slowly by evolution. When we reflect on the long path that produced the human mind, it can feel almost dreamlike. Tiny primates moving through ancient forests, early hominins learning to walk across open landscapes, hands shaping the first stone tools, firelight flickering across curious faces, language forming slowly in shared sounds, symbols appearing in marks on stone, stories traveling from one generation to the next, each step so gradual that no individual could notice the transformation taking place. And yet, over immense spans of time, those small steps accumulated into something entirely new. A mind capable of imagination, a mind capable of reflection, a mind capable of wondering about its own origins. But here is something worth pausing on. Evolution never intended to create philosophy. It never aimed to produce art galleries, libraries, or telescopes. Natural selection simply favored traits that helped individuals survive and reproduce. Stronger memory helped track food sources. Better communication improved cooperation. Greater social awareness strengthened group bonds. Yet, when these abilities combined within one nervous system, unexpected consequences appeared. Language allowed ideas to spread. Culture allowed knowledge to accumulate. Imagination allowed humans to explore possibilities beyond immediate reality. And suddenly, a brain designed for survival became something more. A mind. This transformation may truly have been an evolutionary accident, not an accident in the sense of randomness without cause, but an outcome no evolutionary process could fully predict, a side effect of complexity. Sometimes it helps to think of evolution as a kind of long experiment. Nature does not plan ahead. It tests variations. Most variations disappear. Some persist. And occasionally, a small change interacts with many other factors in ways that produce entirely new possibilities. The human mind may be one of those possibilities, a result of many separate evolutionary threads weaving together, genes duplicating, neurons forming new connections, social groups growing larger, language expanding, culture accumulating. No single moment created human consciousness. Instead, the system slowly approached a threshold, and once that threshold was crossed, something remarkable happened. The brain became capable of representing the world internally, and then representing itself. There is something quietly profound about this ability. When you think about your own thoughts, you are observing a process that began long before human history. Your awareness is built upon countless evolutionary steps. The structure of your brain reflects ancient environments. The emotional systems guiding your behavior developed in small tribal groups. Your language abilities evolved through social cooperation across thousands of generations. Even the curiosity that led you here, listening to this story, may be an echo of survival instincts. Curiosity helped our ancestors explore new landscapes, discover new resources, learn new strategies, and today, that same curiosity leads us to explore ideas, science, philosophy, the origins of life, the origins of the mind itself. When scientists study the brain today, they often feel a sense of wonder, not only because of its complexity, but because of the strange loop it creates. A brain studying brains, a mind attempting to understand the process that produced minds. It is almost like a mirror reflecting another mirror, and each reflection reveals a little more detail. Yet some mysteries remain. We still do not fully understand how consciousness arises from neural activity. We still debate which evolutionary pressures played the largest roles. We still uncover new genes and neural pathways that shaped brain development. The story of the human mind is still being written, even now, and perhaps that is fitting, because the human mind itself is not a finished creation. It continues evolving, not only biologically, but culturally. New technologies reshape how we think. New discoveries change how we understand the universe. Artificial intelligence introduces entirely new forms of problem-solving systems. Each generation grows up within a slightly different cognitive world, and with each generation, the landscape of thought expands. Yet beneath all these modern layers, the ancient structure of the brain remains. The emotional circuits, the social instincts, the storytelling tendencies, the fascination with patterns. All of these traits trace back through millions of years of evolution to forests, savannas, firelit gatherings beneath open skies. Sometimes when we slow down and reflect, it becomes clear how extraordinary this journey has been. From simple nervous systems in ancient oceans, to neurons forming complex networks, to primates navigating forest canopies, to early humans shaping stone tools, to storytellers painting animals on cave walls, to scientists mapping galaxies and genomes. It is a long arc, and we stand somewhere along its unfolding path. The human mind is both ancient and new, ancient in its biological roots, new in its cultural possibilities, and perhaps the most fascinating part of this story is that we are not just observing it. We are participants within it. Every thought you have, every idea you explore, every question you ask, all of these continue the long experiment of evolution. But as we come toward the end of this quiet journey, it may be worth returning to the simple mystery with which we began. How did a biological organ become capable of wonder? The answer, it seems, lies not in one moment of creation, but in countless small steps. Tiny genetic shifts, environmental challenges, social cooperation, cultural learning, each one nudging the brain toward greater complexity, until eventually a mind appeared that could look back and ask, how did this happen? And that question, that quiet curiosity, may be one of the most beautiful outcomes of the evolutionary accident that gave us the human mind. Because curiosity keeps the story moving forward. It encourages exploration, discovery, understanding, and somewhere, perhaps, in a distant future, new minds will look back at this moment in the same way we look back at ancient fires on the savannah, as one small chapter in a much larger story. But before we close this journey completely, there is one final reflection waiting ahead, a gentle ending to this long story of evolution, curiosity, and the mind. The day moves slowly toward evening again. Light softens across the landscape. Shadows grow longer. The sky shifts from bright blue toward the warm colors of sunset. And once more, somewhere on Earth, a small flame flickers into life as people gather together at the end of the day. In some ways, the scene is not so different from the fires our ancestors sat beside tens of thousands of years ago. The world has changed in extraordinary ways. Cities rise where forests once stood. Machines cross oceans and skies. Signals travel instantly across the planet. Yet the human mind, the quiet observer behind our eyes, is still built from the same ancient foundations. And that is where our story gently comes to rest. Across the long sweep of evolutionary time, the emergence of the human mind was not a single dramatic event. There was no moment when nature suddenly decided that thought should exist. Instead, there were countless small steps. A gene duplicated here, a neural pathway strengthened there. A new social behavior appeared. A tool was shaped. A sound became a word. A story passed from one voice to another, each change so small it barely mattered on its own. Yet together, these changes slowly transformed the brain, like drops of water shaping stone across thousands of years, until eventually the structure of the mind became capable of something entirely new. Reflection. Reflection is a curious ability. It allows us to step back from experience and examine it, to ask questions about events, to consider possibilities, to imagine futures that do not yet exist, and perhaps most mysteriously, reflection allows the mind to turn inward, to observe its own thoughts, to notice emotions rising and falling, to wonder about the nature of consciousness itself. No other species on Earth appears to explore this inner landscape in quite the same way. And yet, this ability may have emerged almost accidentally, a side effect of neural complexity and social intelligence combining over time. Evolution built systems for survival, but those systems became flexible enough to explore ideas far beyond survival. And from that flexibility grew philosophy, science, music, and art. It is easy in modern life to forget how extraordinary this is. We think all day long. We plan tomorrow. We remember yesterday. We imagine stories. We question the nature of reality. These abilities feel ordinary because we use them constantly. But from the perspective of Earth's long history, they are astonishingly new. For billions of years, life existed without reflection. Creatures sensed the world, reacted to it, survived within it, but they did not wonder about it. Then slowly, quietly, evolution produced a brain capable of curiosity. And with that curiosity came the first questions. Why does the sun rise? Where do animals go when they disappear? What lies beyond the horizon? Those early questions eventually grew into something even larger. What is life? What is the universe? What is the mind? And perhaps most intriguingly, what created the conditions for these questions to exist at all? If we look at the story from the widest possible perspective, something beautiful appears. The universe began with simple particles. Over time, those particles formed stars. Stars forged heavier elements. Those elements built planets. On at least one planet, chemistry became biology. Biology evolved into complex life, and eventually, complex life developed minds capable of awareness. In a quiet sense, the universe became able to observe itself, not through intention, not through design, but through the slow unfolding of natural processes. The human mind is one expression of that unfolding, a structure made of atoms that can think about atoms, a network of neurons that can ask how neurons create thought. It is a strange and wonderful loop, But perhaps the most comforting realization is this: the human mind is not separate from nature. It is one of nature's creations. The same processes that shape mountains and oceans also shape the brain. The same evolutionary forces that guided animals across ancient landscapes also guided the development of our thoughts. We are not outside the story of life. We are part of it. And our minds carry echoes of that long journey, echoes of forests where primates first explored branches, echoes of savannas where early humans walked upright, echoes of fires where language and stories began. Even now, when we sit quietly and let the mind wander, those ancient layers remain present. The curiosity, the imagination, the deep sense of connection to the natural world. There is another gentle thought worth holding as we close. The human mind is still evolving, not only through biology, but through culture and knowledge. Each generation grows up surrounded by ideas that previous generations discovered. Books, science, music, art, technology. Every discovery becomes part of the shared landscape in which future minds grow. And because of that, the story of the mind is still unfolding. Future generations may understand consciousness more deeply. They may explore new frontiers of knowledge. They may discover new ways of thinking that we cannot yet imagine. Just as our ancestors could not have imagined cities, satellites, or digital networks. The story continues, quietly, gradually, as it always has. But for tonight, it is enough simply to appreciate the journey, from ancient oceans to modern minds, from simple neural circuits to self-awareness, from survival instincts to philosophical reflection, all carried forward by millions of years of small changes, an evolutionary accident perhaps, yet also one of the most remarkable outcomes in the history of life, because through the human mind, the universe gained something rare, the ability to pause, to wonder, to ask questions beneath a sky full of stars, and so the fire grows quiet again. The last embers glow softly in the darkness. Somewhere, someone looks up at the night sky and feels that same ancient curiosity stirring within. The same curiosity that shaped our ancestors. The same curiosity that carried the human mind across continents and centuries. And perhaps that quiet sense of wonder is the most enduring legacy of the evolutionary accident that gave us the human mind. A gentle reminder that we are part of a much larger story, one that began long before us, and one that will continue, quietly unfolding, far into the future.